Indiana said that that needed to be covered under the claim. There's no current case like that yet in Kentucky. There may be some brewing at the lower levels. There is one case of a school bus driver who became so obese and the arthritis got so bad that she could no longer drive the bus, and she ended up qualifying for permanent disability under the state employees' disability system. But that's not yet percolated through the Kentucky workers' comp system as far as I can tell. So more to come on that, and I'm sure at some point you'll have a case where one of you will have to deal with this issue and try to get good evidence as to what caused what. Very difficult to sort out, particularly in states where we have to give an apportionment rating, if you're familiar with that, where we have to decide what percentage of some person's disability came from personal factors versus work-related factors. That directly hits your bottom line, whatever the end result of that number is, and it's becoming more and more difficult to pick those, to get those numbers just right. Other workplace impacts in your system. In North Carolina, for example, we have a dramatic demographic difference between some of the urban and rural areas, to where some of the counties, such as where Chapel Hill is, has about 1/3 the rate of diabetes and obesity of some of our rural counties. So even though some of the smaller counties have a much lower cost of living, and they're being highly incentivized at the county level for employers to open a new site or a new branch or a new factory in those counties, some of the employers have decided to stay in the much higher, much more expensive for real estate and labor, much more expensive Chapel Hill area, because they know that their projected workers' comp and group health plan costs are going to be so much dramatically lower over the next 10, 15, 20 years, all other things being equal. They think it counteracts even the tax incentive structures on the table in some of the other counties. So it really is starting to play in corporate mindsets of how you look at the future and do these different projections and predictive modeling of what these things are going to cost you in the future. Lots of other considerations as to how this must be handled at the administrative level. Many HR managers struggle with these issues of how to deal with the increases in personal health conditions among your workforce. Something that sounds even as silly and small as handicap parking. I've dealt with several employers who simply don't have the physical space at whatever their factory or however it was built 20, 30, 40 years ago. They don't have the space to handle state placards for handicap parking. And there are threats of lawsuits all the time over the ability to create new space or get rid of the grass or cut out the trees just so you can get somebody within their state-mandated 200 feet from the front door of the facility where they work. So there are just so many other issues coming down the line that you'll eventually have to deal with and figure out what your corporate response is going to be and how you manage employees so that you can keep the good employees. But that you can manage these other issues at the lowest expense possible and stay legally compliant. Many other ways that these come into play, and we'll talk about a few. Other impacts, and some of you, depending on what industry you're in, have already seen dramatic cost increases for this. Those of you who have commercial drivers in your organizations, there is a possibility that we'll now start doing sleep apnea testing on all workers with a body mass index greater than 30, which that alone will cost a dramatic amount of money. But what's really going to cost you is if they have severe sleep apnea and they're not compliant with the treatment, I'm not going to certify them to drive for you any longer. We have 8 million people in this country with a commercial driver's license, and current estimates are somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of them may not qualify for it if this new federal guideline goes into place. That's going to put a dramatic pressure on many of you who rely on drivers to be able to do these things. School bus drivers in the state system, you name it. It's going to completely change how we do things and who's qualified for what jobs. It'll be a tremendous turmoil. Scientifically appropriate, but economically disastrous. Each 2-pound gain in an average adult increases their risk of developing weight-bearing joint arthritis, so ankles, knees, hips, by 9 to 13%. So a 200-pound gain, for example, over a 10-year period, almost guarantees the future development of complete arthritis in some of the weight-bearing joints. If these people are absolutely healthy and perfectly capable of doing every aspect of your job on your loading dock when they're hired, but then 25 years later they're 150 pounds heavier and they have terrible arthritis in their weight-bearing joints, you're guaranteed to eventually end up with a workers' comp case that's dramatically expensive in that person. It's almost a foregone conclusion in some cases. In some other cases, we now know that obesity triples your risk of having carpal tunnel syndrome, triples your risk. That's a lot higher than any of the epidemiological studies that ever correlated it with keyboard typing and some other kinds of assembly line work. Obesity is dramatically more important risk factor than a lot of the job factors that ended up as compensable workers' comp claims in your organizations when this became a lot more common 10, 15 years ago. And because many of the toxic chemicals, now safety programs are so good, this is less of an issue than 10 and 20 years ago. But many of the chemicals used in certain workplaces and some of the life sciences companies where we go into, many of those toxic chemicals are specifically what we call lipophilic, or they bond chemically with fat molecules more so than non-fat molecules. So a worker who performs the same exact job and has the same dose as a thin worker in the same lab right next to them might have a dramatically higher risk of eventually having a toxic problem down the road, nerve damage or something else, simply because those chemicals, instead of just being excreted either in feces or urine, are bound for long periods of time in fat molecules and then able to exert their toxic effects in somebody down the road. Just as other examples of the way, beyond the group health plan, this is changing the nature of the American workforce and making us less competitive with some of the other countries. If you have a large number of diabetics in your workforce, and I'm certain that you do, knowing the data that we've seen, and you think, well, we don't do dramatically hardcore manual labor where I work, so this doesn't really apply to me. Let me scare you a little bit with this slide from the CDC. On the left is the rate or the percentage of diabetic adult workers, the percentage of diabetic adult workers who say they have a mobility limitation that causes them a problem at work and at home performing these kinds of activities. Walk a quarter mile, stand for 2 hours, climb up 10 steps, or stoop, bend, or kneel. We all know, obviously and intuitively, really hardcore physical jobs are going to be a problem if you've got advanced diabetes. We may not have thought before that these things that we probably take for granted and would never say that's a heavy manual labor job, these are just inherent parts of most jobs, other than completely sedentary ones. But somewhere between a third and a half of your diabetic workers may have some mobility problem doing those what we would consider simple tasks, that you may or may not have some sort of an ADA review process to make sure that they're not a setup for a terrible workers' comp claim down the road either. Also, with the changes that many of you are aware in the Americans with Disabilities Act last year, changed the approach that you may need to take in some of these situations, such that at the individual level, it's still very legally prudent to assume that someone you hire to do a job is healthy and able to do that job, so that you are not, in a sense, regarding them as disabled before they get a crack at trying to prove they can do a job. However, once either that worker or the supervisor or somebody else in the organization realizes there may be a problem with performing those job functions, then you need to have a very robust ADA review process in place to make sure that requested reasonable accommodations are thoroughly investigated through an interactive process with that employee to determine whether you are legally required to do something so that they can then go back into your workplace and do these things that they say they have trouble doing, so that you decrease your risk of work-related and non-work-related problems and accidents down the road, as well as be compliant with the ADA. At the job level, position by position, it's important to know what physical limits there are of each job. Physical therapists and many other groups are excellent at ergonomics professionals at coming in and measuring exactly what the physical requirements are of particular